The Reconquista is a period in the history of the Iberian Peninsula spanning approximately 770 years, between the initial Umayyad conquest of Hispania in the 710s and the fall of the Emirate of Granada, the last Islamic state on the peninsula, to expanding Christian kingdoms in 1492. The Reconquista ended immediately before the European rediscovery of the Americas, the New World, which ushered in the era of the Portuguese and Spanish colonial empires. Historians traditionally mark the beginning of the Reconquista with the Battle of Covadonga, in which a small Christian army, led by the nobleman Pelagius, defeated an army of the Umayyad Caliphate in the mountains of northern Iberia and established a Christian kingdom in Asturias. Concept and duration. Catholic, Portuguese and Spanish historiography, from the beginnings of historical scholarship in Christian Spain until the 20th century, stressed the existence of a continuous phenomenon by which the Christian Iberian kingdoms opposed and conquered the Muslim kingdoms, understood as a common enemy who had militarily seized Christian territory. The concept of a Christian reconquest of the peninsula first emerged, in tenuous form, at the end of the 9th century. A landmark was set by the Christian Chronica Prophetica, a document stressing the Christian and Muslim cultural and religious divide in Iberia and the necessity to drive the Muslims out. Nevertheless, the difference between Christian and Muslim kingdoms in early medieval Spain was not seen at the time as anything like the clear-cut opposition that later emerged. Both Christian and Muslim rulers fought amongst themselves. Alliances between Muslims and Christians were not uncommon. Blurring distinctions even further were the mercenaries from both sides who simply fought for whoever paid the most. The period is looked back upon today as one of relative religious tolerance. The Crusades, which started late in the 11th century, bred the religious ideology of a Christian reconquest, confronted at the time with a similarly staunch Muslim jihad ideology in Al-Andalus by the Almoravids, and to an even greater degree by the Almohads. In fact, previous documents from the 10th and 11th centuries are mute on any idea of reconquest. Propaganda accounts of Muslim-Christian hostility came into being to support that idea, most notably the Chanson de Roland, a fictitious 12th-century French version of the Battle of Roncesvalles past dealing with the Iberian Saracens, and taught as historical fact in the French educational system since 1880. Many recent historians dispute the whole concept of Reconquista as a concept created a posteriori in the service of later political goals. It has been called a myth. One of the first Spanish intellectuals to question the idea of a reconquest that lasted for 8 centuries was José Ortega y Gasset, writing in the first half of the 20th century. However, the term is still widely in use. Background: Islamic conquest of Christian Iberia in 711. Muslim Moors, mainly North African Berber soldiers with some Arabs, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and began the conquest of the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania. After the conquest of the Visigothic kingdom's Iberian territories, the Muslims crossed the Pyrenees and took control of Septimania in 719, the last province of the Visigothic kingdom to be occupied. For the stronghold of Narbonne, they launched raids into the Duchy of Aquitaine. At no point did the invading Islamic armies exceed 60,000 men. These armies established an Islamic rule that would last 300 years in much of the Iberian Peninsula and 770 years in Granada. Islamic rule after the establishment of a local Emirate Caliphate will lead the first ruler of the Umayyad Caliphate, removed many of the successful Muslim commanders. Tariq ibn Ziyad, the first governor of the newly conquered province of Al-Andalus, was recalled to Damascus and replaced with Musa bin Nasser, who had been his former superior. Musa's son, Abd al-Aziz ibn Musa, apparently married Eglona, Roderick's widow, and established his regional government in Seville. He was suspected of being under the influence of his wife, accused of wanting to convert to Christianity, and of planning a secessionist rebellion. Apparently a concerned al-Walid I ordered Abd al-Aziz's assassination. Caliph al-Walid I died in 715 and was succeeded by his brother Sulayman ibn Abd al-Malik. Sulayman seems to have punished the surviving Musa bin Nasser, who very soon died during a pilgrimage in 716. In the end, Abd al-Aziz ibn Musa's cousin Ayyub ibn Habib al-Akma became the emir of Al-Andalus. The conquering generals weren't necessarily acting very independently, due to the methods of communication available. Successful generals in the field and in a very distant province would also gain the personal loyalty of their officers and warriors, and their ambitions were probably always watched by certain circles of the distant government with a degree of concern and suspicion. Old rivalries and perhaps even full-fledged conspiracies between rival generals may have had influence over this development. In the end, the old successful generals were replaced by a younger generation considered more loyal by the government in Damascus. A serious weakness amongst the Muslim conquerors was the ethnic tension between Berbers and Arabs. The Berbers were indigenous inhabitants of North Africa who had only recently been converted to Islam. They had provided most of the soldiery of the invading Islamic armies but sensed Arab discrimination against them. This latent internal conflict jeopardized Muslim unity. After the Islamic Moorish conquest of nearly all of the Iberian Peninsula in 711–718 and the establishment of the Emirate of Al-Andalus, an Umayyad expedition suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Toulouse and was halted for a while on its way north. Odo of Aquitaine had married his daughter to Uthman ibn Nasser, a rebel Berber and lord of Sardinia, in an attempt to secure his southern borders in order to fend off Charles Martel's attacks on the north. However, a major punitive expedition led by Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the latest emir of Al-Andalus, defeated and killed Uthman, and the Muslim governor mustered an expedition north across the western Pyrenees, looted areas up to Bordeaux, and defeated Odo in the Battle of the River Garonne in 732. A desperate Odo turned to his arch-rival Charles Martel for help, who led the Frankish and leftover Aquitanian armies against the Umayyad armies and defeated them at the Battle of Tours in 732, killing Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi. Moorish rule began to recede, but it would remain in parts of the Iberian Peninsula for another 760 years. Beginning of the Reconquista. The first victory in resistance to Muslim rule occurred in Asturias in 722. A drastic increase of taxes by the emir, Anbasa ibn Suhaim al-Kalbi, provoked several rebellions in Al-Andalus, which a series of succeeding weak emirs was unable to suppress. Around 722, a Muslim military expedition was sent into the north in late summer to suppress a rebellion led by Pelagius of Asturias. The Muslim forces overran much of Pelagius' territory, forcing him to retreat deep into the mountains. Pelagius and a few hundred men retired into a narrow valley at Covadonga, where they could defend against a broad frontal attack. For that, Pelagius' forces routed the Muslim army, inspiring local villages to take up arms. Despite further attempts, the Muslims were unable to conquer the mountain stronghold. Pelagius' victory at Covadonga is hailed as the beginning of the Reconquista. No Muslim source mentions the battle at Covadonga, in contrast with the Battle of Toulouse in 721, with a death toll of perhaps tens of thousands, which was mourned for centuries as a large-scale tragedy by the Iberian Muslims. For Pelagius, however, the Christian victory secured his independent rule. The precise date and circumstances of the battle are unclear. Among the possibilities is that Pelagius' rebellion was successful because the greater part of the Muslim forces were gathering for an invasion of the Frankish Empire. During the first decades, Asturian control over part of the kingdom was weak, and for this reason it had to be continually strengthened through matrimonial alliances with other powerful families from the north of the Iberian Peninsula. Thus, Ermesinda, Pelagius' daughter, was married to Alfonso, Peter of Cantabria's son. Alfonso's children, Froila and Idazinda, married Munia, a Basque from Alava, and Silo, a local chief from the area of Pravia, respectively. Quote, after Pelagius' death in 737, his son Favila of Asturias was elected king. Favila, according to the chronicles, was killed by a bear during a trial of courage. Pelagius' dynasty in Asturias survived and gradually expanded the kingdom's boundaries until all of northwest Iberia was included by roughly 775. However, credit is due not to him but to his successors. Alfonso I rallied Galician support when driving the Moorish army out of Galicia and an area of what was to become Leon. Further expansion of the northwest kingdom towards the south occurred during the reign of Alfonso II, and for a short time, it almost reached Lisbon. The kingdom became firmly established with the recognition of Alfonso II as King of Asturias by Charlemagne and the Pope. During his reign, the bones of St. James the Great were declared to have been found in Galicia, at Santiago de Compostela. Pilgrims from all over Europe opened a channel of communication between the isolated Asturias and the Carolingian lands and beyond. Two northern realms, Basque Navarre and Asturias, despite the small size, demonstrated an ability to maintain their independence. Because the Umayyad rulers based in Córdoba were unable to extend the power over the Pyrenees, they decided to consolidate the power within the Iberian Peninsula. Arab Berber forces made periodic incursions deep into Asturias but failed to make any lasting gains against the strengthened Christian kingdoms. Franks and Al-Andalus. After the Umayyad conquest of the Iberian heartland of the Visigothic kingdom, the Muslims crossed the Pyrenees and gradually took control of Septimania, starting in 719, with the conquest of Narbonne through 725 when Carcassonne and Nîmes were secured. For the stronghold of Narbonne, they tried to conquer Aquitaine but suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Toulouse. 10 years after halting their advance north, Odo of Aquitaine married his daughter to Uthman ibn Nasser, a rebel Berber and lord of Sardinia, in an attempt to secure his southern borders to fend off Charles Martel's attacks on the north. However, a major punitive expedition led by Abdul-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, the latest emir of Al-Andalus, defeated and killed Uthman. Charles Martel, the Umayyad governor, mustered an expedition north across the western Pyrenees, which made its way to Bordeaux and defeated Odo in the Battle of the River Garonne in 732. A desperate Otto sought assistance from his arch-rival, Charles Martel, who led the Frankish and remaining Aquitanian armies against the Muslims and defeated them at the Battle of Tours in 732, killing Abdul-Rahman al-Ghafiqi. In 737, Charles Martel led an expedition south down the Rhone valley to assert his authority up to the lands held by the Al-Andalus Umayyads. These had been called in by the regional nobility of Provence in a military capacity, probably fearing Martel's expansionist ambitions. Martel went on to attack the Umayyads in Septimania up to Narbonne, but he had to lift the siege of Narbonne and return to Lyon and Francia after subduing various Umayyad strongholds, such as Arles, Avignon, and Nîmes, leaving behind a trail of ruined towns and strongholds. Pepin the Younger and Charlemagne, after expelling the Muslims from Narbonne in 759 and driving the forces back over the Pyrenees, the Carolingian king Pepin the Short conquered Aquitaine in a ruthless 8-year war. Charlemagne followed his father by subduing Aquitaine by creating counties, taking the church as his ally and appointing counts of Frankish or Burgundian stock, like his loyal William of Gellone, making Toulouse his base for expeditions against Al-Andalus. Charlemagne decided to organize a regional sub-kingdom in order to keep the Aquitanians in check and to secure the southern border of the Carolingian Empire against Muslim incursions. In 781, his 3-year-old son Louis was crowned King of Aquitaine, under the supervision of Charlemagne's trustee William of Gellone, and was nominally in charge of the incipient Spanish March. Meanwhile, the takeover of the southern fringes of Al-Andalus by Abd-ar-Rahman I in 756 was opposed by Yusuf ibn Abd-al-Rahman, autonomous governor or king of Al-Andalus. Abd-ar-Rahman I expelled Yusuf from Cordova, but it took still decades for him to expand to the northwestern Andalusian districts. He was also opposed externally by the Abbasids of Damascus, who failed in their attempt to overthrow him. In 778, Abd-al-Rahman closed in on the Ebro Valley. Regional lords saw the Umayyad emir on the gates and decided to enlist the nearby Christian Franks. According to Ali ibn al-Atir, a Kurdish historian of the 12th century, Charlemagne received the envoys of Sulayman al-Arabi, Hussein, and Abu Turid the Diet of Paderborn in 777. These rulers of Zaragoza, Girona, Barcelona, and Huesca were enemies of Abd-ar-Rahman I, and in return for Frankish military aid against him offered the homage and allegiance. Charlemagne, seeing an opportunity, agreed upon an expedition and crossed the Pyrenees in 778. Near the city of Zaragoza, Charlemagne received the homage of Sulayman al-Arabi. However, the city, under the leadership of Hussein, closed its gates and refused to submit. Unable to conquer the city by force, Charlemagne decided to retreat. On the way home, the rearguard of the army was ambushed and destroyed by local forces at the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass. The Song of Roland, a highly romanticized account of this battle, would later become one of the most famous chansons de geste of the Middle Ages. Around 788, Abd-ar-Rahman I died and was succeeded by Hisham I. In 792, Hisham proclaimed a jihad, advancing in 793 against the kingdom of Asturias and the Franks. In the end, his efforts were turned back by William of Gellone, Count of Toulouse. Barcelona, a major city, became a potential target for the Franks in 797, as its governor Zayd rebelled against the Umayyad emir of Córdoba. An army of the emir managed to recapture it in 799, but Louis, at the head of an army, crossed the Pyrenees and besieged the city for 2 years until it finally capitulated on December 28, 801. The main passes in the Pyrenees were Roncesvalles, Somport and La Jonquera. Charlemagne established across them the vassal regions of Pamplona, Aragon, and Catalonia respectively. Catalonia was itself formed from a number of small counties, including Pallars, Girona, and Urgell. They protected the eastern Pyrenees passes and shores and were under the direct control of the Frankish kings, forming the last remains of the Spanish marches. 4 small realms pledged allegiance to Charlemagne at the start of the 9th century: Pamplona and the counties of Aragon, Sobrarbe and Ribatejo. Pamplona's first king was Inigo Ista, who allied with his Muslim kinsmen the Banu Qasi and rebelled against Frankish overlordship and overcame a Frankish expedition in 824 that led to the setup of the Kingdom of Pamplona. Aragon, founded in 809 by Asnar Galinde, grew around Jaca and the high valleys of the Aragon River, protecting the old Roman road. By the end of the 10th century, Aragon was annexed by Navarre. Sobrarbe and Ribatejo were small counties and had little significance to the progress of the Reconquista. In the late 9th century, under Count Wilfrid, Barcelona became the de facto capital of the region. It controlled the other counties' policies in a union, which led in 948 to the independence of Barcelona under Count Borrell II, who declared that the new dynasty in France were not the legitimate rulers of France nor as a result of his county. These states were small and, with the exception of Navarre, did not have the capacity for attacking the Muslims in the way that Asturias did, but the mountainous geography rendered them relatively safe from being conquered, and the borders remained stable for 2 centuries. Military culture in medieval Iberia. In an atmosphere of constant conflict, warfare and daily life were strongly intertwined during this period. Small, lightly equipped armies reflected the need for society to be on constant alert. These forces were capable of moving long distances in short times, allowing a quick return home after sacking a target. Battles were mainly waged between clans, expelling intruder armies as sacking expeditions. In the context of the relative isolation of the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of Europe, and the contact with Moorish culture, geographical and cultural differences necessitated the use of military strategies, tactics, and equipment that were markedly different from those found in the rest of Western Europe. During this period, medieval Iberian armies mainly comprised 2 types of forces: the cavalry and the infantry, or peones. Infantry only went to war if needed, which was not common. Cavalry and infantry. Iberian cavalry tactics involved knights approaching the enemy, throwing javelins, then withdrawing to a safe distance before commencing another assault. Once the enemy formation was sufficiently weakened, the knights charged with thrusting spears. There were 3 types of knights: royal knights, noble knights, and commoner knights. Royal knights were mainly nobles with a close relationship with the king, and thus claimed a direct Gothic inheritance. Royal knights were equipped in the same manner as the Gothic predecessors: breastplate, kite shield, a long sword, javelins, spears, and a Visigothic axe. Noble knights came from the ranks of the infanzones, or lower nobles, whereas the commoner knights were not noble but were wealthy enough to afford a horse. Uniquely in Europe, these horsemen comprised a militia cavalry force with no feudal links, being under the sole control of the king or the Count of Castile because of fueros with the crown. Both noble and common knights wore leather armor and carried javelins, spears, and round tasseled shields, as well as a sword. The peonies were peasants who went to battle in service of the feudal lord. Poorly equipped with bows and arrows, spears and short swords, they were mainly used as auxiliary troops. The function in battle was to contain the enemy troops until the cavalry arrived and to block the enemy infantry from charging the knights. The longbow, the composite bow, and the crossbow were the basic types of bows and were especially popular in the infantry. Armor was typically made of leather, with iron scales. Full coats of chain mail were extremely rare and horse barding completely unknown. Head protections consisted of a round helmet with nose protector and a chainmail headpiece. Shields were often round or kidney-shaped, except for the kite-shaped designs used by the royal knights, usually adorned with geometric designs, crosses or tassels. Shields were made out of wood and had a leather cover. Steel swords were the most common weapon. The cavalry used long double-edged swords and the infantry short, single-edged ones. Guards were either semicircular or straight, but always highly ornamented with geometrical patterns. The spears and javelins were up to 1.5 meters long and had an iron tip. The double axe, made of iron, 30 centimeters long, and possessing an extremely sharp edge, was designed to be equally useful as a thrown weapon or in close combat. Maces and hammers were not common, but some specimens have remained and are thought to have been used by members of the cavalry. Finally, mercenaries were an important factor, as many kings did not have enough soldiers available. Norsemen, Flemish spearmen, Frankish knights, Moorish mounted archers, and Berberite cavalry were the main types of mercenaries available and used in the conflict. Technological changes. This style of warfare remained dominant in the Iberian Peninsula until the late 11th century, when couched lance tactics entered from France. Although the traditional horse javelin shot techniques continued to be used, in the 12th and 13th centuries, soldiers typically carried a sword, a lance, a javelin, and either bow and arrows, a crossbow, and darts, bolts. Armor consisted of a coat of mail over a quilted jacket, extending at least to the knees, a helmet or iron cap, and braces protecting the arms and thighs, either metal or leather. Shields were round or triangular, made of wood, covered with leather, and protected by an iron band. The shields of knights and nobles would bear the family's coat of arms. Knights rode in both the Muslim style, a laginetta, a short stirrup strap and bended knees allowed for better control and speed, or in the French style, a lebrida, a long stirrup strap allowed for more security in the saddle when acting as heavy cavalry. Horses were occasionally fitted with a coat of mail as well. Expansion into the Crusades and military orders. In the High Middle Ages, the fight against the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula became linked to the fight of the whole of Christendom. The Reconquista was originally a mere war of conquest. It only later underwent a significant shift in meaning toward a religiously justified war of liberation. The papacy and the influential Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy not only justified the acts of war but actively encouraged Christian knights to seek armed confrontation with Moorish infidels, instead of with each other. For the 11th century onwards, indulgences were granted. In 1064, Pope Alexander II promised the participants of an expedition against Barbastro a collective indulgence 30 years before Pope Urban II called the First Crusade. Papal interest in Christian-Muslim relations in the peninsula are not without precedent. Popes Leo IV, John VIII and John XIX are all known to have displayed substantial interest in the region. Not until 1095 and the Council of Clermont did the Reconquista amalgamate the conflicting concepts of a peaceful pilgrimage and armed knight-errantry. But the papacy left no doubt about the heavenly reward for knights fighting for Christ. In a letter, Urban II tried to persuade the Reconquistadors fighting at Tarragona to stay in the peninsula rather than joining the armed pilgrimage to conquer Jerusalem, saying that their contribution for Christianity was equally important. The Pope promised them the same indulgences that he had promised to those who chose to join the First Crusade. Later military orders like the Order of Santiago, Montesa, Order of Calatrava, and the Knights Templar were founded or called to fight in Iberia. The popes called the Knights of Europe to the Crusades in the peninsula. After the so-called disaster of Alacoste, French, Navarrese, Castilian, Portuguese and Aragonese armies united against the Muslim forces in the massive Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. The large territories awarded to military orders and nobles were the origin of the latifunda in today's Andalusia and Extremadura in Spain, and Alentejo in Portugal.